Today's program is supported by K2 Integrity. K2 is the premier global risk advisory firm. In an ever changing world filled with uncertainties and risk, K2 helps its clients with better insights, better solutions, and better decisions. K2 Integrity, believe in better. For more, visit k2integrity.com. I'm Elaine Dzinski, and this is Coercive Capital on the Illicit Edge Network. The illicit economy is large, opaque, and destabilizing. From smuggling and trafficking to cyber fraud and trade-based money laundering, the shadow economy is estimated to represent more than $2 trillion of illegal activity annually. The real-life consequences? Deaths by overdose, violence in communities, and destabilizing governments. And the international criminal networks that drive the illicit economy have continued to evolve and grow more sophisticated with every operation. My guest, David Luna, is an expert on the illicit economy. He is the founder and executive director of the International Coalition Against Illicit Economies. He has also held senior positions with the U.S. Department of State and in the White House, and has worked internationally with the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development and the UN. We recently spoke about the contours of the shadow economy and why breaking the corruptive power and financial power of these transnational criminal networks is a critical element of our national security strategy. This is a great time to be talking about the illicit economy and your work in this space over the last, more than 2 decades now, probably 3 decades, has been defining. When I think about combating the illicit economy, I think of your work, both at the State Department, where you advised successive administrations on understanding and rooting out the illicit financial risks and illicit economy risks that we're going to talk about today, and now the work that you're doing in the private sector and through ICAIE, which we'll also talk about. So you've seen the challenges from a variety of perspectives, and as you've defined it, combating the dark side of globalization. I always think it's interesting to share with people how you got started in this field and ultimately your transition from a career at State Department into the private sector. How did you get into this work?
Well, that is a very interesting story, Elaine. It's funny. When I went to college, I wanted to be a doctor, and took all these pre-med courses. But part of being in college is to find yourself and really grow as a person, as well, to find interests that are more relevant as one matures. And after deciding that I didn't want to do pre-med anymore, I pivoted towards pre-law and ended up taking more history courses. I took a lot of archaeology courses as well. In fact, I became an archae major, and I was very, interested in college on cultures and history, including from a geopolitical perspective. And so, having pivoted to law school, I spent 3.5 years at Catholic University, and one of them here in Washington, D.C. And one of the great things about being in Washington, D.C. are the opportunities, the internships. And while I was working for a couple law firms, I also had the opportunity to work in the U.S. Congress, where I got to learn more about not only the legislative branch, but how the legislative branch, the U.S. Congress, works with the executive branch on formulating various policies, but my interest was more on foreign policy and national security. So having spent some time in the U.S. Senate working on congressional investigations, I went onwards to work for the White House, for the U.S. Department of Labor, working on trade and international agreements related to the environment and labor. And then through fortune, I was able to get a position at the U.S. Department of State, working for the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement, bears INL, which is a great bureau. It's euphemistically called the drugs and thugs. But there I got exposed to issues like corruption, organized crime, the illicit trade, obviously after 9/11, counterterrorism became a very prominent issue for not only the State Department, but across the national security community.
In your role at ICAIE, where you're executive director and founder, the International Coalition Against the Illicit Economy, you're doing some interesting work on really continuing to define, but also move into the solution sets around what it means to combat the influence of illicit actors, transnational criminal networks, those that are really working outside of the formal financial systems to sow a lot of chaos in economies, in political systems. Tell us a little bit more about ICAIE, how it got its start, and how it's approaching this issue set.
Right. So after 22 years working for the U.S. government, mostly at the State Department, and we worked, the bilateral, regional, multilateral accounts. Again, primarily working on corruption, organized crime, and terrorism. But during the four successive administrations that you mentioned up front, it was really interesting to see the national security framework as it related to those transnational threats. Embedded in some of these strategies and initiatives was the importance of public-private partnerships. So having worked again to build, in many respects, a really global infrastructure and capacities to counter um, organized crime, for example, we got, or I got exposed more to the importance of public-private partnerships. So one reaches a point in one's career where one senses it's time to try new things in life and exercise my energies to develop new entities like the NGO, the International Coalition Against Economies, to really bring the private sector more to the fight to counter a lot of these transnational security threats, including the illicit trade. So in 2017, after I left the State Department, we were able to establish ICAIE, the coalition that I just mentioned. But since that time, we have been able to really build some dynamic private sector partnerships that really complement what governments are doing, including working with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the U.S. Council for International Business at OECD, to bring that private sector arm, because I really believe in the importance of whole of society collective action, so that different sectors could do more together in countering some of these illicit threats.
And when we talk about the illicit economy, I think it would be helpful for listeners to understand how you would define that. What comprises the illicit economy as you think of it? And then let's talk a little bit about the scope and the scale of the problem of the illicit economy. So, what comprises that notion of the illicit economy?
So, in many respects, the global illegal illicit economy is huge, right? I mean, it's really an ecosystem of criminality and corruption that converges with other illicit vectors. Um, as you may recall, we worked together at the World Economic Forum, and there were some really good studies that were done at that time, including efforts by the U.S. Interagency and other partners as well, to really try to project or estimate the scale, the breadth and scale of the global illicit economy, which is really staggering. I mean, it constitutes between 7 to 50% of global GDP, and I mean, if one were to do the math, it's really trillions of dollars, right? I mean, at the very lowest levels, it could be between 5 to 7 trillions of dollars every year. So whether it's money laundering, and I think the latest IMF estimates were 2.6 trillion from bribery, which is another 1 trillion, to counterfeits, which is 500 million, and some of the other illicit areas like human trafficking, environmental crime, the illegal tobacco trade, really, also has some tens of billions of dollars that are really generated by criminal organizations and illicit networks. So, again, the scale of today's ecosystems of criminality and corruption is just simply staggering. So, that really puts front and center just the magnitude of some of these illicit threats.
It really does, and I think we see pieces of this coming out in the public conversation about fentanyl, and we'll get back to that a bit later in terms of this, convergence of, um, drug trafficking, money laundering, the impact on, societies like the US, and what it means to really, both understand and dismantle transnational networks that are having impact. It's a really good example, I think, of how uh, US security is being impacted by one aspect of the illicit economy. But more generally, how do you think that our security and foreign policy is undermined by these aspects of the illicit economy? And how do we need to start thinking about this space uh, perhaps a little bit differently as a disruptor to free and open economies and societies?
So, on many levels, these global ecosystems of criminality, the illicit trade, illicit economies, do impact not only American security, American competitiveness, but really everyday American citizens across some communities in the United States. If you look at the issue, as you mentioned, of narcotics or fentanyl, where we have had too many Americans die every year. I think some of the estimates were the past 4 or 5 years is that we have lost more American citizens through the deadly fentanyl that compared to our involvement in various wars from Vietnam to Iraq to Afghanistan. So it does have a very significant impact. But I think, in addition to the lives that are lost every day, it's the proceeds that are derived from fentanyl that really help to finance other insecurities. For example, in Mexico, some of the profits really go towards human trafficking, towards illicit medicines, so on and so forth. That yeah, from a convergence perspective, any one of these illicit threats is a big challenge for the United States and our partners. But when it converges, again with other criminalities, it just becomes a bigger threat altogether. And again, some of these dirty monies that are derived from fentanyl or other illicit activities help to destabilize governance and market institutions. And we see that clearly in Mexico, how the Sinaloa or the cartel Jalisco Generacion continue to penetrate government institutions and infiltrate critical industries. Again, that's just one area. But again, if you look at the issue of counterfeit medicines, illicit pharmaceuticals, they obviously end up doing severe harm to the health and safety of our citizens. And we kind of saw that during COVID-19, how a lot of these counterfeit medicines and personal protective equipment ended up really doing some harm to our citizens.
Yeah. So you've pointed to a couple of interesting trends. One is the proliferation of business lines for cartels, for criminal organizations. Whereas, maybe 20 years ago, we would know a particular criminal network for their activity in drugs, narcotics trafficking. Now they might be operating across a range of issues from smuggling and trafficking to counterfeiting and money laundering on a much larger scale. So that is that seems to me like that's one angle that we really need to be thinking about, the proliferation of these different operational models and business lines, if you will. And then there's another question that I would raise about how these transnational networks are cooperating with each other. What's your take on that? And for example, what we've seen around Chinese money laundering networks operating across many different countries, um, the extension of Mexican cartel operations into Africa. Can you talk to us a little bit about what you're seeing in that space?
There's been, in many respects, a transformation of transnational criminal organizations where you do see more, if you will, a joint venture or leveraging of some organizations working with other, criminal organizations. We see it in Canada, for example, where you do have the Mexican cartels quite active in laundering their proceeds, including working with some Chinese money laundering organizations to really clean that money up. But in other parts as well, in South America, you're beginning to see not only the Mexican cartels, but some of the gangs from Central America or the Tren de Aragua from Venezuela. You have a more active presence in some of the economies in South America, but you're also seeing Eurasian mafias really engaging and profiting from some of the illicit markets in South America, and you're beginning to see some of the devastating effects from some of the convergence and alliances between transnational criminal organizations in places like Ecuador, where you have like local gangs there affiliated in many respects with Mexican cartels to destabilize the government in Ecuador. You're beginning to see more of the fentanyl trade emanate, become a bigger concern in places like Chile or Peru. But in that part of the world, I mean, you also have Hezbollah, terrorist organization that is really leveraging the insecurities and really the corruption in a place like Paraguay, where it enables them to really engage in a whole array of illicit trade activities, including to launder proceeds that in the past have helped to finance their more global operations, including supporting Hamas and Gaza. There, you also see the PCC, the first capital command from Brazil, also engaging with all sorts of illicit bad actors, illicit networks in South America. So, they're leveraging infrastructure expertise to export not only the violence, but a lot of illicit goods and contraband to all parts of the world.
Yeah. I want to pick up on the South America or Western Hemisphere theme for just a minute because there's so much discussion right now about uh, resetting U.S. relations in the Western Hemisphere. And one question I've been thinking about is, can we really establish a productive economic and political environment for the U.S. and partners and allies in the region without addressing some of the underlying illicit finance and illicit economy risks that are pervasive? And you've mentioned various examples of that influence throughout the hemisphere. So, what do you think? I mean, can we look at these issues separately from a broader foreign policy and trade reset in the Western Hemisphere?
No, I mean, I think we need to be looking at all of these issues from an interconnectedness of vectors, if you will. This is why I think what the president is trying to do by elevating or leveraging tariffs to really encourage partners like Mexico and Colombia to really elevate their game to fight the fentanyl trade. and to really go after the money laundering enablers as well. Because I think um, they do have a ripple effect of the criminality in not only these countries, but in South America and Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, in Europe, all over the world, where because of the diversification from the illicit trade to the licit, a lot of these organizations are, again, able to penetrate financial markets, economic markets, and the critical industries as well. So it does have not only a law enforcement, a, criminal impact, but it does harm, you know, other aspects of national life in some of these countries, including economic trade, and obviously public health and safety. And so it's all interconnected. And I think the U.S. has smartly always leveraged our diplomatic, our intelligence, our military, in some cases, and economic tools to take a more robust approach to combating transnational organized crime. And I do applaud the Trump administration for, again, elevating this threat convergence approach, because it is tied to all aspects of life in some of these countries.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I just wrote a piece in the New York Post on the executive order that Trump issued a couple weeks ago on designating international cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. And I think that was a specific response to the fentanyl challenge, but the implications of that and the ability of the US and hopefully allies and partners to use the full range of financial warfare tools against cartels could be meaningful in a way that we really haven't seen up to this point. So I think the implications of that we'll see. We have to resource properly. But what would you tell U.S. agencies, to do or to how to direct these efforts in ways that could be more meaningful? Is it, building on programs and initiatives that we already have in place? Is it looking at new ways to address these transnational threats? What would you tell the Trump administration?
Well, it's all of that. I mean, we do have to take a more full spectrum approach, a more holistic, including the whole of society. And I do think what is important here is to, again, take a more elevated approach to countering, whether it's the cartels, whether it's Hezbollah, whether it's Eurasian mafias or the Chinese syndicates. Um, the key, I think, in these efforts is always information sharing, coordination between the various agencies that have been tasked to combat some of these threats. And I do see, the follow-up to the executive orders that, DHS has been coordinating more with DEA. The FBI obviously is going through a transformation in some ways, but they too, along with the other parts of DOJ, have been asked to really bring some other capabilities to get more robustly target the cartels. So actionable intelligence is very important, but obviously needs to be coordinated first and foremost within the U.S. National security community, but also having good discussions with our Mexican and Canadian partners, certainly as it relates to the current U.S. homeland approach to the cartels of fentanyl, because it's also important to put that political pressure to strengthen the political will in Mexico and Canada. And you saw some of the response from the Mexican president and the Canadian prime minister to bring more resources to the fight. In the case of Canada, hopefully with the announcement of the new fentanyl czar, they can coordinate more with DEA and other law enforcement agencies, again, to do more disruptions, more investigations to really dismantle not only the cartels, but I think the approach that the Trump administration is taking is to really focus on financial tools as well, because I do think going after some of the enablers, including banks in Mexico and Canada and China, I think is critical to begin to really turn the tide against the cartels to the extent that the U.S. can leverage some of those military capabilities as well from an intelligence perspective to do more damage. I think that's important as well.
Yeah, yeah. So let's pull the thread a little bit on this engagement with governments, because I do think that there's another challenge, which is um, instances where we have state capture through transnational criminal networks. There is major concern that cartels have infiltrated state and local government structures within Mexico. I think that's probably been happening for years. We have examples of the Chinese Communist Party supporting the production of fentanyl precursors, and through that, emboldening the Chinese money laundering networks that are managing all of this. When we see this convergence of transnational criminal networks and states, uh, that's a particularly thorny problem. Um, and there are probably examples with Russia, North Korea, and Iran, where we see the blurring of lines between these illicit actors uh, and sovereigns, if you will. Um, what about that challenge? And are there different ways that we need to be thinking about those interactions?
Well, based on my experience working at the State Department, I think one always has to be honest and frank with these governments. I mean, I worked on the U.S. China law enforcement, quite a lot of cooperation mechanism, focusing more on corruption. And, I think it's important to, again, have those frank discussions with China, with Venezuela, with Mexico, you mentioned Russia, and many others in Paraguay as well. But it is a more complex environment, is it not? When you start integrating issues of migration, issues of trade, not that we compromise any of our national interests with any of these governments, but we do need to underscore the importance of joining the U.S. in fighting, again, the cartels. In the case of China, really helping the U.S. to really disrupt these Chinese money laundering operators, organizations, including in the U.S. So DHS has done a really good job of really outlining the extent of these Chinese money laundering organizations in the United States. And a lot of focus tends to be along the border, whether it's Canada or Mexico or inside these countries. But I think we need to also, again, this is where the coordination, taking a more strategic, holistic approach to really go after the neighbors as well in the United States will be very important. I think it was very significant to really sanction TD Bank in Canada because they too have been part of the problem and then helping to launder the proceeds for the cartels and the Chinese triad. So one has to be honest, and a part of diplomatic efforts is to really try to work through a lot of these geopolitical foreign policy sub issues. And Venezuela, it's tricky right now because of migration, but we need to put pressure on Maduro to also fight the Granada to address the complicity of the government involved in transnational organized criminal activity.
Dave, I want to go back to the foreign terrorist designation that was part of Trump's executive order. We talked about it in the context of fentanyl. It's very clear that we need a variety of tools to address threats in the illicit economy and how transnational criminal networks are operating. One aspect of that, I think, is getting to beneficial ownership structures. Another is looking at how we can use authorities around prosecuting corruption related to these criminal networks. How do you see this tool set, and what would we be thinking about, or should be thinking about, in terms of leveraging different kinds of tools to achieve different objectives in weakening these transnational entities?
Great question, Elaine. Similarly to how the U.S. leveraged terrorist financing tools to go after Al Qaeda, Taliban, and other terrorist organizations, I do think that we need to be using these financial crime tools to go after the cartels, including supporting the Corporate Transparency Act, because I do think that a lot of these bad actors and the illicit networks, criminals, hide behind anonymous shell companies. So really, putting the issue of beneficial ownership of these entities, corporate entities, that help to really launder, again, the criminally derived proceeds of cartels, of criminal organizations, and others, like, again, the Chinese sun triads, who were profiting enormously from the drug and fentanyl trade. So I do think, again, some of those tools are very important. I do think examining or developing a national strategy to combat trade-based money laundering is very important, because some of these bad actors, again, are leveraging these other forms of money laundering, including in the digital commerce space, using crypto currencies, using other forms of digital finance to launder these proceeds. I do think as well that we need to sustain and even fund more of the trade transparency units that I think have been effective systems to work with our partners in Mexico and other parts of Latin America, if not globally, and to really bring that financial intelligence to the fight. You mentioned corruption. I do think, looking at the executive orders, that the Department of Justice and other law enforcement agencies have been asked to really look at the corruption related to the illegal fentanyl trade and kind of narcotics efforts. But at the same time, I am concerned about weakening the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, because that has been a powerful tool to really encourage our other governments to make the fight against corruption an important priority. If you look at China with their Belt and Road Initiative, and how they really leverage strategic corruption, they're able to really expand their global security footprint around the world, to not only control ports, to be more active in free trade zones, to make inroads into both the licit and the illicit economies in our partners' countries. So I think weakening the FCPA also really harms our efforts to make strategic corruption by China, by Iran, and others more difficult to combat a bigger transnational security threat. So, I would encourage the Trump administration to really recalibrate tools like the FCPA, the CTA, the Corporate Transparency Act, to bring these authorities and capacities to the fight against global transnational criminal organizations and the threats that they pose.
Today's program is supported by K2 Integrity, the premier global risk advisory firm. In today's world, threats can arise anywhere, at any time. Threats to your organization's operations, financial stability, or reputation. K2 offers a better way to counter the threats facing your organization. K2 provides critical intelligence and actionable strategies to uncover the truth, make decisions, and reduce risk. K2 helps you face critical challenges with an experienced team and the ability to navigate the most complex issues to arrive at better outcomes. That's why clients partner with K2 to help them thrive in an ever changing world filled with uncertainties and risk by providing better insights, better solutions, and better decisions. K2 Integrity. Believe in better. For more, visit k2integrity.com. So you've done a lot of work in the multilateral space with the OECD, countering illicit financial networks and a lot of anti-bribery work. You mentioned our work at the World Economic Forum. You've been active in other multilateral engagements with the UN. Where do you think we have the most opportunity to work through multilateral engagement at this time, which is a particularly challenging time for multilateral agendas? Uh, but you spend a lot of time cultivating those partnerships, thinking through how we can leverage not only U.S. but broader international frameworks. Is there a future for this when it comes to combating the illicit economy, and where are the opportunities going to be in the next few years?
Yeah, I do think that international organizations, whether it's the OECD, whether it's Interpol, Europol, the World Customs Organization, focus more on illicit trade and combating transnational organized crime, are very important to have those partnerships because it's not only the leveraging again of actionable intelligence, but bringing their expertise, their capacities to do more together is very critical. Having worked with some of these organizations, I do think that they work in helping the United States to do more disruptions, more dispensing, not only against the cartels, but again, human trafficking, counterfeits, environmental crime, which is really a new illicit trade area that's just exploding because some of these newer areas of illicit trade are easy money for criminals. Um, so as the administration embarks on the review of some of these international organizations, I hope that they see the value and the expertise and the capacities that they can bring to really achieve higher results for the president's priorities, including the cartels, the illegal fentanyl trade, and money laundering. I think that if and the OECD have done a really good job on doing evidence-based research that helps to inform the U.S., the private sector, civil society on the scale of some of these threats. So, again, I'm a big believer of collective action, of bringing a whole society approach, and I do think our partners within these international organizations can help the United States and the Trump administration to do more.
So, how should we bring this conversation around the illicit economy more effectively to the American public? I assume you agree we should be doing that, although if not, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. But there's a story here. I think it's certainly about fentanyl. 10 years ago, it might have been focused on the impact of counterfeits and why there's a supply chain behind purchasing a counterfeit that's problematic for our country, for other countries. What should we be talking about around the illicit economy, and how do we position that right now?
Well, I think the efforts that you're doing with Coercive Capital and the Illicit Edge is a forum beginning to educate, different communities on not only on some of the threats, some of the, bad actors, but on the scale and harms that citizens and how they're impacted every day. Again, from the fentanyl to counterfeit medicines to human trafficking. So building, I think, an awareness more nationally, but more globally as well on again, the convergence, the interconnectedness of all of these threats, and how at the end of the day, they do end up having severe harm to communities and constituents. This is why I'm hoping to work with the U.S. Congress to develop an anti-illicit trade caucus to begin to work with the administration, to work with the private sector, to work with communities, to help inform on the scale of these criminalities, but in a way that harms them on a daily basis. So I do think education and public awareness of the harms are critical. But so are like infographics. I think doing investigative docu-series, and we're beginning to see a lot of that, and ICAIE is devoting some energies to really bring digital tools to educate communities on, again, the interconnectedness between fentanyl, money laundering, human trafficking, counterfeits, and how that impacts all aspects of American life and the lives of our allies around the world.
One other area that may need to be recalibrated is how we think about these threats in the illicit economy from a national intelligence perspective. How should we be doing that? Do we need a kind of a recalibration or refocusing of national intelligence priorities? And what would that look like?
In many respects, the president has started doing that, right, through executive orders and elevating an illicit threat like the illegal fentanyl trade. The administration has started doing that by encouraging, calling on not only the law enforcement committee, but across the interagency to work with DHS, to work with DEA, to bring more of their expertise, capabilities, and resources to the fight. But you make a good point, because in the past, areas or threats like human trafficking, like counterfeits, were not necessarily a first tier national security priority. I won't get into how the our intelligence community determines the different tiers. Uh, uh, in many respects, some of the newer criminal areas were always relegated to third or even fourth tier um, priorities within this framework. That is important because human resources and capital resources attached to the different tiers. Historically, whether it was Russia, China, weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, I think the cartels, the drug wars were always the first tier. But some of these other areas have not. So, I hope that President Trump, that the administration can really build on efforts, for example, that President Bush had undertaken from the threat convergence, and really President Obama. And our good friend Juan Zarate did, I think, an excellent job in bringing attention to how a lot of these criminal threats are interconnected in the way that begins a process of leveraging resources, analysts, investigators, prosecutors, to really combat some of these threat environments more robustly again, and to internationalize the fight as well, to engage other governments, other international organizations, regional bodies, really take that threat convergence approach, because as you're combating the fentanyl trade or other narcotics threats, you can leverage the capacities in some of these illicit environments to similarly tackle counterfeits, human trafficking, the illegal wildlife trade, that, again, historically were not a higher priority within the intelligence framework. But now, through that threat convergence lens, takes a higher higher a priority. And the important there is to, again, whether it's sub-Saharan Africa or South America, Mexico, Canada, you're bringing all of these resources in a more coordinated manner to do more damage across an illicit environment in these spaces.
So the threat convergence framework is pretty compelling and could be an interesting mechanism for further engagement with the private sector. Um, can you talk to us a little bit about how you see private sector engagement in this challenge? Certainly, there are instances of counterfeiting and issues that impact supply chains directly. Probably get more attention from the private sector. But what else could we be doing to raise the profile of this threat convergence and what the implications are for private sectors?
So integrating more public-private partnerships into the various national strategies, national initiatives, because you're right. I think the private sector, they have a lot of capacities, a lot of resources. Oftentimes, they have boots in the ground because they're operating in some of these markets, whether it's manufacturing or selling their goods, that they can see clearly some of these criminal threats because they're impacted not only from a market share, but oftentimes from a physical security as well. And again, they often do have really good market intelligence, if you will, that can really help our law enforcement communities to be able to do more targeted enforcement. You're right, you see that a lot as it relates to counterfeits. And I know that the National IPR Center does a really good job of working with the private sector. And that we should be taking that as a model to really do more to counter the fentanyl trade and more, more strategically across illicit environments and in places for bringing that private sector capability can really help not only the U.S. but our partners in those countries to reduce, to mitigate some of the risk and some of the harms caused by international criminal organizations and their enablers.
Tackling the illicit economy, one that spans geographic borders and implicates sophisticated criminal networks, is both daunting and urgently needed. For too many years, we have allowed cartels to operate with impunity. However, the Trump administration appears ready to unleash financial warfare on these networks. Thanks to David Luna for shedding some light on these issues. For listeners interested in learning more about the work of the International Coalition Against Illicit Economies, check out their website at ICAIE.com. I'm Elaine Dzezinski, and this is Coercive Capital on the Illicit Edge Network.